Vincent Cialini was the undisputed king of a silent empire. For over 30 years, he ruled the city's underworld through cold calculation and a terrifying ability to read a man's intentions just by the movement of his lips. But behind the sharp suits and the intimidating tattoos lay a secret held in a world of absolute stillness. Vincent had never heard a single sound in his life. To the world, he was a stone wall. To himself, he was a man trapped in a permanent void. That Tuesday morning, the routine of his quiet study was broken by Tamara, the new maid whose presence was as unassuming as a shadow. She moved with a rhythmic grace he could feel through the floorboards, until suddenly she stopped. Her gaze didn't drop in fear. Instead, it narrowed on his ear with the precision of the nurse she used to be. As her trembling fingers reached out, the formidable Don Cialini did something he never did. He stayed still. With one steady, clinical tug, she extracted a dark, calcified mass that had been buried in his skull since childhood. A violent rush of air hit his eardrums like a physical blow. The world didn't just open, it exploded. For the first time, he heard the frantic thud of his own heart and the sharp intake of Tamara's breath. The silence hadn't been a curse of birth, it had been a cage built by someone he trusted. Stay with me until the end, because the first conversation Vincent overhears in his silent home will turn his loyalty into a bloodbath. Before we reveal the traitor, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. In the sprawling, marble-floored corridors of the Cialini estate, silence wasn't just a condition, it was a law. This was the Cialini Protocol, a complex system of living designed around the man at the center of the storm. Because Vincent could not hear the click of a heel or the cocking of a hammer, his world was governed by sight and touch. The staff moved like ghosts, trained to enter his line of sight before approaching, never to startle the man who could end a life with a flicker of his finger. Every room in the mansion was outfitted with soft, recessed lighting that pulsed in specific colors to signal visitors, phone calls, or emergencies. To an outsider, it looked like a high-tech sanctuary, but to Vincent, it was a gilded cage of his own making. He sat in his heavy leather chair, his fingers pressed against the mahogany desk, feeling the low-frequency thrum of the house's ventilation system. It was his only connection to the physical world, a constant, rhythmic vibration that told him the house was alive. His security team communicated in a specialized shorthand of tactical signs, their faces masks of stony neutrality. They knew that the Don's eyes were sharper than any man's ears. He could catch the slight tremble in a soldier's lip or the micro-expression of greed in a business partner's eyes from across a room. This sensory deprivation had forged him into a predator of unparalleled focus. Because he lived in a world without the distraction of noise, he saw the truth that others missed. Rebecca, the elegant woman who had stepped in as a mother figure after his parents' passing, moved through the house with a practiced, fluid grace. She was the architect of this quietude, ensuring that the Cialini silence was never breached. She often touched his shoulder with a gentle, reassuring hand, her face a picture of tragic sympathy for the boy who had lost his hearing to a freak childhood infection. Beside her was always Dr. Philip Jones, the man who had managed Vincent's condition for 3 decades. The doctor would nod solemnly, his lips moving in slow, exaggerated shapes as he explained that the nerves were dead, that science had no answer for the void in Vincent's head. Vincent accepted it with the stoic pride of a king. He had built a fortress of silence, believing it was his greatest defense. He didn't realize that, in a house where no one spoke aloud, the deadliest secrets were the ones being whispered just behind his back. Tamara Jackson stepped through the heavy oak doors of the Cialini estate with her head held high, though the unnatural stillness of the foyer made the hair on her arms stand up. She had been warned during her interview that the Don was a man of particular needs, but she hadn't expected the oppressive, velvet weight of a house that refused to make a sound. The other maids moved with a practiced, eerie gliding motion, their eyes averted and their mouths shut. It was a house of shadows, but Tamara was used to looking for what was hidden in the light. Before she had fallen on hard times and taken this position, Tamara had spent 6 years as an ENT surgical nurse. Her eyes were trained to spot the subtle asymmetries of the human body, the tiny physical tells that most people ignored. As she was led through the grand study to be introduced to the master of the house, she saw him. Vincent Cialini. He sat like a statue carved from granite, his dark suit perfectly tailored, his gaze fixed on a ledger with a terrifying intensity. She stood at the periphery of his vision as instructed, waiting for him to look up. When he finally did, his eyes were a piercing, cold blue that seemed to search her soul for a pulse. Rebecca stood at his side, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder like a queen mother guarding a wounded prince. "This is Tamara," Rebecca mouthed, her movements slow and theatrical. "She will be handling your private quarters now." Vincent gave a curt, stiff nod, his face remaining a mask of serious indifference. But as Tamara stepped forward to set a tray of water on the side table, she caught a glimpse of his profile in the morning sun streaming through the window. Most people saw a powerful man with a tragic disability. Tamara saw something else. She noticed the way the skin just in front of his tragus, the small cartilage flap of the ear, puckered slightly, a sign of deep-seated pressure. She saw the minute, almost invisible inflammation of the outer canal. To a layman, it was nothing. To a nurse who had seen thousands of ears, it didn't look like the atrophy of dead nerves. It looked like an obstruction. As she turned to leave, her heart hammered against her ribs. She had watched the way Dr. Jones leaned in to check Vincent's vitals with a dismissive, perfunctory air. A doctor of his stature should have seen what she just saw. As she walked back to the servants' quarters, the silence of the mansion no longer felt like a sign of respect. It felt like a cover-up. She realized then that she wasn't just there to clean the Don's rooms. She had stumbled into a medical crime scene. For the next 3 days, Tamara moved through the executive suite like a ghost, her cleaning rags and polish serving as a front for a much deeper investigation. Each time she entered Vincent's presence, she felt the heavy, vibrating weight of the Cialini protocol. The mansion was a theater of the absurd. People spoke in exaggerated gestures or written notes, while the Don sat in the center of the quiet, a powerful man disconnected from the basic frequency of life. While dusting the intricate molding behind his desk, Tamara found herself positioned perfectly to observe him from an angle no one else dared to take. Vincent was engrossed in a document, his head tilted slightly to the left. In the harsh, clinical glow of his desk lamp, Tamara saw it again, the subtle, unnatural distension of the ear canal. It wasn't just inflammation. There was a structural oddity, a tiny hint of something dark and solid wedged deep within the shadows of the meatus. Her nursing instincts screamed at her. Congenital deafness usually left the outer ear pristine, the failure lying deep within the cochlea or the auditory nerve. But this looked like a physical barrier, something that had been there so long the body had tried to grow around it. She watched as Dr. Jones entered the room for a scheduled maintenance check. The doctor's hands were steady, but his eyes were quick and shifty. He performed a cursory glance into Vincent's ears with an otoscope, clicking the light off so fast it was impossible for him to have actually seen the eardrum. "Everything is as it has always been, Vincent," Jones signaled with a rehearsed, sympathetic wave of his hand. Tamara felt a chill run down her spine. The doctor wasn't just failing to see the blockage, he was actively ignoring it. As she wiped the mahogany surface of a nearby bookshelf, her hand trembled. She knew that if she were right, Vincent Cialini wasn't a victim of nature. He was a victim of a decades-long conspiracy. The curse he bore with such stoic pride was a fixable mechanical error. She looked at the Don's stern, tattooed face. He was the most feared man in the city, capable of ordering a hit with a simple nod, yet he was being toyed with by the very people who claimed to be his guardians. The curiosity was no longer just professional, it was a moral fire. She knew the risks of touching a man like Vincent without invitation, let alone suggesting his entire reality was a lie. But as she watched him sit in that profound, manufactured silence, she realized she couldn't let it continue. She needed to get closer. She needed him to trust her fingers near his head, even if it meant risking the wrath of the entire Cialini family. The opportunity arrived on a humid Thursday afternoon. Vincent sat in his study, the collar of his white shirt open to reveal the intricate ink of the protective sigils across his chest. He looked exhausted, his jaw tight with the physical strain of navigating a world that refused to speak to him. Tamara approached him, not with the subservient shuffle of the other staff, but with the steady, purposeful stride of a woman who had walked hospital wards for a decade. She didn't use the flashing light signal. Instead, she stepped directly into his line of sight and held up a small, professional medical light she had smuggled in from her old kit. Vincent's blue eyes narrowed, a flash of irritation flickering across his face. He began to raise a hand to dismiss her, a gesture that usually sent servants scurrying, but Tamara didn't flinch. She stood her ground and pointed toward his ear, then to the light, and finally to her own chest, tapping where a nurse's badge used to hang. Vincent paused, his hand hovering in midair. He was used to being handled like a fragile relic by Rebecca or a specimen by Dr. Jones, but the look in Tamara's eyes was different. It was clinical, piercing, and entirely devoid of the pity he loathed. He watched her lips as she spoke, though he couldn't hear the softness of her voice. "Let me look," she mouthed, her movements slow and deliberate. "I think I can help with the pressure." A heavy silence, thicker than the usual quiet of the mansion, settled between them. To allow a stranger, a maid, to touch him so intimately was a violation of every Cialini security protocol. His life was built on the premise that no one got close enough to strike. Yet there was a strange, magnetic pull in her confidence. He felt the low thrum of the house through his chair, a reminder of the prison he lived in. With a slow, stiff inclination of his head, he gave his consent. As Tamara stepped into his personal space, the air seemed to hum with tension. She reached out, her fingers warm and surprisingly steady as they brushed against the hair at his temple. Vincent's body was a coiled spring, his muscles tensing beneath his dark suit, but he did not pull away. He looked straight ahead, his breath shallow, as she gently tilted his head toward the window light. For the first time in 30 years, the dawn allowed someone to see past the myth of the silent king to the man underneath. Tamara leaned in, the beam of her light cutting through the shadows of his ear canal, and what she saw confirmed her darkest suspicions. It wasn't a defect, it was a cork. The air in the study felt thick enough to suffocate as Tamara reached into the small kit hidden in her apron pocket. She produced a pair of fine-tipped medical tweezers, the steel glinting under the afternoon sun. Vincent remained frozen, his gaze locked on the far wall, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned a ghostly white. He was a man who had faced down firing squads without blinking, yet he was trembling at the touch of a woman whose only weapon was a nurse's intuition. Tamara took a slow, grounding breath. She knew that if she slipped, if she caused him pain or struck a nerve, the guards stationed just outside the door would have her off the premises, or worse, before she could explain. Gently, she used one hand to pull the pinna of his ear upward and backward, straightening the canal just as she had done 1,000 times in the clinic. With the other hand, she guided the tweezers into the narrow space. Deep inside, she felt the metal tips meet resistance. It wasn't the soft, yielding texture of skin or the wax of a healthy ear. It was hard, calcified, and stubbornly lodged. She gripped the edge of the dark mass and began to apply a slow, steady traction. Vincent let out a low, guttural hiss, his eyes squeezing shut as the sensation of something moving inside his skull sent a jolt of primal fear through his system. "Stay with me," Tamara mouthed, though she knew he couldn't hear her. Her focus was absolute. She felt the blockage give way, sliding inch by agonizing inch through the canal. With one final, delicate tug, the object came free. It was a jagged, waxy plug, nearly an inch long, reinforced with a strange, synthetic fiber that had turned black with age. It looked less like a natural growth and more like a deliberate seal. Tamara held it up in the light, her own hands shaking now that the deed was done. The effect on Vincent was instantaneous and violent. He didn't just move, he recoiled as if he'd been struck by lightning. He clutched the side of his head, his face contorting in an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. The world of vibrations and muffled shadows was gone. In its place was a sudden, piercing roar, the sound of his own ragged breathing, the sharp intake of Tamara's gasp, and the terrifying, metallic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. For the first time in 30 years, the silence hadn't just been broken, it had been shattered. He looked at the small, dark object in Tamara's hand, and then up at her, his blue eyes wide with a realization that was more painful than the extraction itself. The miracle was real, but the life he had lived was a lie. The roar of the world was in physical assault. Vincent lurched forward, his hands slamming onto the mahogany desk for balance, but even the contact of his palms against the wood produced a sound, a dry, sliding friction, that made him flinch. His brain, starved of auditory input for 3 decades, was suddenly drowning. Every movement was a thunderclap. Every shift of his clothes against his skin sounded like the rushing of a waterfall. Then, through the chaotic static of his newly awakened senses, a rhythmic, piercing strike began to dominate the room. Click, clack, click, clack. Vincent's head whipped toward the corner of the study. The grandfather clock, a piece of furniture he had lived with his entire life, was no longer just a silent sentinel of carved wood. It was a rhythmic beast, pulsing with a metallic heartbeat that seemed to echo inside his very marrow. He stared at the swinging pendulum, mesmerized and terrified. The sound was sharp, relentless, and mathematically perfect. It was the sound of time itself, a concept he had only ever understood through the slow movement of shadows across the floor. He looked down at his own chest, his shirt still open. He could hear the frantic, wet thud of his heart. It was a heavy, visceral sound that made him feel fragile, human in a way he hadn't felt since he was a toddler. He gasped, and the sound of his own breath, a sharp, hollow whistle through his throat, sent a shiver down his spine. Tamara stood frozen, watching him with a mixture of awe and professional concern. She moved to step toward him, and the floorboards beneath her feet let out a low, agonizing groan. Vincent jumped, his eyes wide and wild, his posture shifting into a defensive crouch. He wasn't just hearing. He was experiencing a sensory explosion that threatened to shatter his mind. He looked at Tamara, and for the first time, he saw her lips move without having to strain to decode them. She wasn't speaking, but her breathing was a soft, rhythmic huffing that felt like a caress against his eardrums. The miracle was beautiful, but it was also a sensory nightmare. He realized then that the world was not a place of peaceful shadows, but a symphony of chaos that he was entirely unprepared to conduct. In the middle of the cacophony, a cold, hard thought began to crystallize. If a clock could sound like a hammer, what would the voices of his enemies sound like? The door to the study creaked open, a long, high-pitched whine that set Vincent's teeth on edge. In the doorway stood Rebecca, her floral dress a soft blur in his periphery, but her presence now carried a weight she had never possessed before. For 30 years, she had been his silent guardian, the woman who communicated with him through gentle touches and exaggerated smiles. Now, as she stepped into the room, he heard the dry, rhythmic swish of her stockings and the heavy, metallic clink of the keys in her handbag. She didn't notice the change immediately. Her eyes went first to Tamara, then to the medical light on the desk, and finally to Vincent's face. He was still trembling, his hands clamped over his ears in a desperate attempt to muffle the newly discovered roar of the air conditioning. "Vincent, dear, what is this?" The voice hit him like a physical blow. It was thin and melodic, yet it carried an underlying rasp that he had never imagined. It was the first human sentence he had ever truly understood through sound, and it felt like a violation. He watched her face, expecting to see joy or wonder. Instead, as Rebecca's gaze landed on the dark, calcified plug resting on the desk, her expression underwent a terrifying transformation. The warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp panic. Her breath hitched, a jagged, aspirated sound that Vincent felt in the pit of his stomach. She didn't rush to embrace him. She didn't weep with relief. Instead, she took a step back, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag until the leather groaned. "What have you done?" she hissed, and though she was looking at Tamara, the venom in her tone was unmistakable. It wasn't the voice of a mothering protector. It was the voice of a warden who had just seen the cell door swing open. Vincent remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the woman he had trusted above all others. Without the Cialini silence to protect her, Rebecca's true nature was leaking through the cracks of her voice. He heard the frantic, uneven rhythm of her breathing, the sound of someone calculating, someone afraid of being caught. She looked at the extraction tool, then at the open collar of Vincent's shirt, her face flickering with a desperate need to regain control. "You shouldn't have touched him," she whispered, her voice trembling with a redirected fury. "You have no idea what you've ruined." To any other observer, she looked like a worried elder, but to Vincent's newly awakened ears, her voice was a discordance of lies. He realized then that the shadow she cast over his life wasn't meant to keep him safe. It was meant to keep him in the dark. Vincent's gaze shifted from the trembling Rebecca to the small, dark object on the desk, then finally to Tamara. The roar of the world was still a jagged blade against his senses, but a cold, calculating clarity was beginning to override the panic. He saw the way Rebecca's hand moved toward the intercom on the wall, her movements frantic. She was going to call the guards. She was going to call Dr. Jones. She was going to seal the cage before he even realized he was free. With a speed that defied his recent disorientation, Vincent lunged across the desk. His hand clamped down over Rebecca's wrist just inches from the button. The sound of his skin hitting hers was a sharp, fleshy slap that echoed like a gunshot in his ears. Rebecca froze, her eyes widening as she looked into the face of a man who was no longer just watching her. He was listening to the frantic, guilty thrum of her pulse beneath his fingers. He didn't look at Rebecca. He turned his head toward Tamara. His throat felt tight, his vocal cords a rusted instrument he hadn't tuned in a lifetime. He took a breath, hearing the dry rasp of air in his lungs, and forced his muscles to move in a way he had only ever mimicked. "Quiet," he croaked. The sound of his own voice was the most terrifying thing he had ever heard, a deep, gravelly vibration that felt like stones grinding together. It was raw and unpolished, but it possessed a terrifying authority. Tamara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, the sound of her intake of breath as clear as a bell. He looked Tamara dead in the eyes, ignoring the whimpering sounds Rebecca was making. He needed to ensure the only person who had ever been honest with him didn't become the next victim of the silence. He gestured between his ear and Tamara, then made a sharp, cutting motion across his lips. "Secret," he whispered, the word more of a tactile sensation than a sound. "No one knows." He saw the understanding dawn in Tamara's eyes. She saw the trap he was in. If the house knew the lion could hear, the traitors would stop whispering and start striking. He needed her to be his ghost, his silent accomplice in a world that was suddenly screaming with hidden truths. Tamara nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement, her eyes reflecting a newfound loyalty. Vincent slowly released Rebecca's arm. The elderly woman stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged, shallow wheezes. She was looking at him with a mixture of horror and suspicion, searching his face for any sign that the miracle had taken hold. Vincent immediately slumped his shoulders, letting his gaze go dull and unfocused, sliding back into the mask of the deaf dawn. He returned to his world of perceived shadows, but for the first time, he was the one holding the light. The heavy, double doors of the study groaned on their hinges, announcing the arrival of Dr. Philip Jones before he even stepped into Vincent's line of sight. To the world, the sound was a mere background noise, but to Vincent, it was the opening note of a theatrical performance. He sat rigidly in his chair, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall, successfully mimicking the 1,000-yard stare of a man trapped in a soundless void. Inside, however, his brain was on fire, cataloging the rhythmic asterisk thud squelch of the doctor's expensive loafers and the metallic jingle of a medical bag. Rebecca stood by the window, her back to Vincent. "He's been acting strange, Philip," she whispered. Her voice, once a comfort, now sounded like the hiss of a coiled viper. "The new girl," she was fiddling with him. "I think she poked something." "Calm yourself, Rebecca," Jones replied. His voice was a rich, practiced baritone, the kind of voice designed to sell confidence to the grieving. "It's impossible. The nerves are necrotic. A maid with a flashlight can't undo 30 years of biological reality." The doctor approached, and Vincent felt the air shift as the man leaned in. For the first time, Vincent heard the sound of the doctor's professional mask slipping, the wet, nervous swallow, the slight wheeze of a man who drank too much scotch and slept too little. Jones clicked his otoscope to life. The high-pitched snick of the switch was like a needle to Vincent's eardrum. As the cold plastic tip entered his ear, Vincent had to fight every instinct to recoil. He could hear the doctor's own sleeve brushing against his lab coat, a sound like sandpaper. He could hear the man's shallow, uneven breathing. "See, perfectly normal," Jones said aloud, his voice booming in the small space of the ear canal. He didn't even look. He was staring at the wall, his mind already on the next lie. He pulled back and patted Vincent's shoulder, a condescending, heavy thud. Then, leaning in close to Vincent's face, Jones spoke slowly, his lips moving in the exaggerated, pantomime shapes Vincent had relied on for decades. "You are fine, Vincent, just tired." But as Jones turned back to Rebecca, his voice dropped to a low, conspiratorial murmur that he assumed was safe from the deaf Dawn. "Whatever she did, it's just localized inflammation. I'll give him a sedative to keep him quiet tonight. We can't have him getting restless now, not when the board meeting is so close." Vincent's heart hammered against his ribs, a rhythmic drum of war. He watched the doctor reach into his bag, the crinkle of plastic and the clink of a glass vial sounding like a death knell. He realized then that the medicine wasn't meant to heal him. It was meant to maintain the silence. He remained perfectly still, a statue of marble and ink, while the sound of his own fury began to drown out the doctor's lies. The moon hung low over the Cialini estate, casting long, skeletal shadows across the marble floors, but the mansion was no longer the tomb Vincent once believed it to be. In the deep of the night, the house breathed. He stood in the darkened gallery, his bare feet pressing against the cold stone, feeling the vibrations he had always known. But now they were accompanied by a terrifying clarity. The hum of the refrigerator in the distant kitchen, the groan of the settling foundation, and the rhythmic, ghostly whistling of the wind through the eaves created a haunting soundscape. He moved like a shadow, guided by his new sense. He approached the heavy oak doors of the small parlor where a sliver of light spilled onto the rug. In the past, he would have walked right in, oblivious. Now he stopped. He leaned his head toward the wood, and for the first time he understood the true power of a closed door. "The sedative didn't take as quickly as I hoped." Dr. Jones's voice drifted through the grain of the wood, muffled but unmistakable. "He's becoming unpredictable, Rebecca. If he starts questioning the pressure in his head, the whole facade collapses." "He doesn't question anything. He's a statue," Rebecca snapped back. Her voice was sharper at night, stripped of the honeyed warmth she used during the day. "But that maid, Tamara, she's the variable we didn't account for. She looks at him with eyes that see too much." Vincent's blood turned to ice. He heard the clink of ice against glass, a sharp, musical sound that felt like a mockery. "It's been 23 years, Jones continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial low. "The trust is established. Once the transfer of the docks is finalized next week, it won't matter if he hears the trumpets of heaven. We'll have the signatures, and he'll be moved to the private care facility in Switzerland. He'll live out his days in the silence he's used to, and we'll have the empire." "He was never meant to be a king," Rebecca whispered, and the coldness in her tone was a physical weight against Vincent's chest. "He was meant to be a placeholder, a deaf, useful ghost." Vincent backed away, his heart thundering in his ears like a war drum. Every word had been a jagged glass shard, tearing away the skin of his reality. His mother and his healer were not his protectors. They were his architects of isolation. They hadn't just stolen his hearing. They had stolen his life, waiting patiently for the moment to discard the shell they had created. As he retreated into the darkness of the hallway, the silence of the mansion was gone forever, replaced by the echoing roar of a betrayal that demanded blood. Vincent stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in his dressing room, the moonlight catching the harsh lines of his physique. For years, he had treated his body as a canvas of silent warnings, a map of ink designed to speak because his voice could not. He traced the dark, intricate sigils that sprawled across his chest and shoulders, the needle-scarred memories of 1,000 hours of pain. Each tattoo was a vow of protection, a symbol of the silent king who ruled a world he couldn't hear. But tonight, as he looked at the ink, he heard the echoes of the needles, the rhythmic, high-pitched buzz he had only ever felt as a stinging vibration against his skin. He focused on the large, ornate script over his heart. It was a memorial to his parents, the former heads of the Cialini family who had perished in a tragedy when he was barely 5. He remembered the smell of the smoke and the blur of the funeral, but most of all, he remembered the hand of Rebecca gripping his own, her face a mask of sorrow. He had always believed his deafness was a result of the trauma from that night, a physical manifestation of a soul that had seen too much and chose to stop listening. Now, with the roar of the world filling his head, the ink felt like a brand of shame. Every line on his skin had been a brick in the wall Rebecca and Jones had built around him. They had encouraged the tattoos, calling them his voice, while they took his real one. They had shaped him into a terrifying, silent icon, a man who looked like a god but was kept as a pet. As he touched the scar tissue near his collarbone, he heard the soft, distant sound of Tamara moving in the servants' quarters below. Her footsteps were a gentle, honest percussion compared to the jagged discord of the house. He realized then that his tattoos weren't just warnings to his enemies. They were the bars of his cage. He had been a placeholder, a tattooed ghost, waiting for the day his guardians decided he had served his purpose. The rage that surged through him was no longer a quiet, internal thrum. It was a loud, vibrating heat. He looked at his reflection, the fair-skinned man with the trimmed beard and the open white shirt, the man the world feared, and he saw a stranger. But that stranger was starting to understand the cadence of power. The ink was old, but the man beneath it was new. He wouldn't wash away the tattoos, he would use them as a mask. He would remain the silent, tattooed king until the moment he decided to let the world hear him roar. The following morning, the atmosphere in the mansion had shifted. To Rebecca and the guards, it was the same heavy, soundless air they had breathed for years, but for Vincent, the house was screaming. He sat in the breakfast nook, his eyes fixed on a newspaper, but his focus was entirely on the kitchen door. He heard the rhythmic asterisk clink asterisk of silver against china and the soft, hurried scuff of Tamara's shoes. Behind him, he heard the low, guttural murmur of his lead enforcer, Marco, speaking to a guard in the hallway. "The old lady wants the maid gone," Marco whispered, his voice a gravelly rasp that Vincent found surprisingly easy to track. "Says she's too familiar with the Dawn. Rebecca wants her reassigned to the docks by tonight." Vincent's jaw tightened. Reassigned was a Ciellini euphemism for a shallow grave. He realized with a jolt of protective fury that Tamara was now in the crosshairs of the very conspiracy she had unmasked. She was the only person in 30 years who had looked at him and seen a man instead of a disability, and he would not let her pay for that kindness with her life. Without looking up from his paper, Vincent raised a hand, making a sharp, authoritative gesture. Marco immediately stopped talking and stepped into the room, bowing his head in the presence of the silent master. Vincent took a small notepad from his pocket, the tool he had used for decades to exert his will, and scribbled a single, forceful command. "Tamara Jackson is under my personal protection. She goes nowhere without my leave. If a hair on her head is touched, the person responsible will answer to me." He slid the note across the table. He heard the sharp asterisk hiss asterisk of the paper against the wood and the sudden, hitching intake of Marco's breath as he read the words. Marco looked from the note to Vincent's cold, unblinking eyes. The enforcer nodded quickly, the leather of his shoulder holster creaking with the movement. A moment later, Tamara entered the room to clear the table. As she reached for his cup, Vincent allowed his hand to brush against hers. It was a brief, warm contact, but in the new, loud world he inhabited, it felt like a vow. He caught her eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. He couldn't speak to her yet, not with the walls having ears, but he made sure his intent was clear. Outside the door, he heard Marco intercepting Rebecca. "The don't orders," Marco's voice boomed, now loud and defiant. "The girl stays. She is his shadow now." The sound of Rebecca's indignant, sharp gasp was the sweetest music Vincent had heard all morning. The Mafia was no longer just his empire. It was now Tamara's fortress. The dining hall was a cathedral of deceptive opulence, illuminated by the flickering warmth of a dozen candles. Vincent sat at the head of the table, his posture the picture of stiff, royal indifference. To anyone watching, he was the same deaf Don he had always been, a man existing in a vacuum of silence, focused entirely on the precision of his steak knife. But beneath the surface, his mind was a high-sensitivity receiver, capturing every vibration and vocal inflection in the room. Across from him, Rebecca and Dr. Jones sat with the relaxed comfort of two hunters who believed their prey was already in the trap. The sounds of the meal were an assault. The scraping of silver against porcelain sounded like swords clashing. The pouring of red wine was a heavy, viscous gurgle. "He looks particularly distant tonight," Dr. Jones remarked, his voice smooth and clinical. He didn't even bother to lower his volume. To him, Vincent was just a piece of furniture that happened to eat. "The sedation from this afternoon is still lingering," Rebecca replied, her tone sharp and devoid of the maternal warmth she performed during the day. "It's better this way. He's easier to manage when he's half asleep. Did you finalize the paperwork for the docs?" "The signatures are all we need," Jones said, followed by the wet, rhythmic sound of him chewing. "The notary is coming tomorrow. We tell him it's a security protocol, he signs the line, and the Cialini assets transfer to the holding company. By the time he realizes he's a beggar, he'll be halfway to the clinic in the Alps." Vincent's grip on his wine glass tightened. The crystal let out a faint, high-pitched protest. He kept his eyes fixed on his plate, watching the reflection of the candlelight in the dark liquid. He heard the smile in Rebecca's voice as she responded. "And the girl, Tamara, you heard the don't decree, he's protecting her." "A temporary setback," Jones dismissed with a light, airy chuckle. "Once he's unwell enough to be committed, her protection means nothing. She'll be handled. Accidents happen to maids in big houses, Rebecca, especially those who stick their fingers where they don't belong." The betrayal was no longer an abstract concept. It was a physical weight in the air, a cacophony of greed and malice. Vincent felt a cold, vibrating fury radiating from his core. They were discussing his erasure and Tamara's death while he sat 3 feet away, laughing at the irony of his silence. As Rebecca reached over and patted his hand, a gesture that used to signify love but now felt like the touch of a spider, Vincent didn't flinch. He let her see the dull, vacant mask she expected. But inside, he was recording every word, every plan, and every threat. The dinner of lies was coming to an end, and for the first time, the guest of honor was the only one who truly knew the menu. The medical suite was a sterile vacuum of white light and stainless steel, a place where Vincent had spent a lifetime being poked and prodded like a broken machine. Dr. Philip Jones moved with a casual, arrogant grace, the rhythmic thump of his footsteps against the linoleum echoing, with a confidence born of 30 years of successful deception. He didn't realize the sound was now a target. "Just a quick check of the vitals, Vincent," Jones said, his voice booming in the quiet room. He reached for his blood pressure cuff, the nylon fabric letting out a sharp, grating scree as he unfurled it. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive coffee and cowardice. "Stay still. This will all be over soon." As Jones turned his back to reach for a syringe, he began to hum, a low, tuneless melody of victory. He thought he was alone in the room with a ghost. But as the doctor turned back around, he froze. Vincent wasn't looking at the wall. He was staring directly into Jones's eyes, his expression as sharp and lethal as a drawn blade. "The docs," Vincent said. The word was a low, volcanic rumble that seemed to vibrate the very air in the room. It was the sound of a man who had spent 3 decades in a cage, finally breaking the lock. The doctor's face drained of color instantly, the glass vial in his hand slipping from his fingers and shattering on the floor with a musical, crystalline explosion. "Vincent," Jones stammered, his voice jumping an entire octave, thin and reedy with terror. You can't. It's a miracle I must have." "You must have lied," Vincent interrupted. His voice was growing stronger with every syllable, a deep, resonant baritone that filled the sterile space. He stood up from the examination table, looming over the smaller man. For the first time, Jones heard the true sound of power, the heavy, deliberate thud of the Don's boots and the creak of his leather holsters as he closed the distance. "I heard you at dinner, Philip," Vincent whispered, leaning down until his lips were inches from the doctor's ear. "I heard the plan. I heard the price. I heard the way you talked about Tamara." Jones began to tremble, a frantic, wet sound of teeth chattering that Vincent found pathetic. The doctor tried to back away, but he hit the cold edge of his own desk. "I am the final diagnosis," Vincent growled, his hand clamping around the doctor's throat. He could hear the man's pulse racing like a trapped bird, a frantic, uneven rhythm of a guilty heart. "And the prognosis for a man who steals a king's world." is terminal. The silence of the clinic was gone, replaced by the sound of justice being served in the dark. Vincent found Rebecca in the solarium, the glass-walled room where she spent her afternoons, surrounded by the delicate, artificial scent of lilies. She was knitting, the rhythmic, metallic click-clack of the needles sounding like a countdown in the heavy air. For a moment, he simply stood in the shadows, listening to the sound of the woman who had raised him. He heard her humming a lullaby, the same one she had hummed when he was 5, the night the world went quiet. "The doctor won't be joining us for tea, Rebecca," Vincent said. The knitting needles didn't just stop. They clattered to the marble floor with a sound like falling coins. Rebecca didn't turn around immediately. He heard the sharp, jagged intake of her breath, followed by a low, mournful moan that escaped her throat before she could stifle it. When she finally faced him, her mask of maternal grace was gone, replaced by the raw, trembling terror of a cornered animal. "Vincent," she whispered, her voice cracking, "you're speaking." "I'm listening, too," he replied, his voice a cold, steady chime. "I heard about the docks. I heard about the clinic in the Alps, but what I haven't heard is why. Why did you kill my world before it even began?" Rebecca slumped into her chair, the wicker groaning under her weight. The tears that began to fall made a soft, wet sound against her silk dress. "Your father was a monster, Vincent," she hissed, the sudden venom in her voice startling him. "He was going to turn you into a weapon. He wanted a son who was a soldier, a man of blood and noise. I couldn't let him have you." She looked up at him, her eyes wild with a twisted sense of justification. "The night of the fire, I didn't just save you from the flames. I saved you from the life he chose for you. I told the doctor to plug your ears while you were recovering. I thought if you couldn't hear the world, you wouldn't learn to be like him. I wanted a son who stayed, a son who was dependent, a son I could keep forever." Vincent felt a coldness settle in his marrow that no heater could touch. It wasn't about the money, or the docks, or the empire. Those were just the doctor's rewards. Her betrayal was born of a suffocating, parasitic love. She had lobotomized his senses to ensure he would never leave her side, turning his life into a silent monument to her own control. "You didn't save me, Rebecca," Vincent said, the words heavy with the weight of 30 lost years. "You just buried me alive." He turned away from her, the sound of her frantic, sobbing apologies fading into a pathetic, distant noise. The mother of the Ciellinis was nothing more than a ghost in a floral dress, and for the first time in his life, Vincent knew exactly what he had to do to bury the past for good. The transition of power happened not with a roar, but with a series of deliberate, audible clicks. Vincent stood in the center of the grand hall, the heavy oak doors sealed shut. For the first time, he wasn't just sensing the presence of his captains by the displacement of air. He was hearing the nervous shift of their weight, the metallic slide of their weapons being checked, and the frantic, shallow breathing of men who realized the rules had changed. Marco stood to his right, his posture straighter than it had been in years. Vincent didn't need a notepad tonight. He stepped onto the dais, the sound of his boots echoing against the vaulted ceiling with a thunderous authority. When he spoke, his voice was no longer a gravelly rasp, but a resonant, commanding baritone that sliced through the murmurs of the crowd like a blade. "The silence is over," Vincent declared. A collective gasp rippled through the room, a wave of sound that Vincent absorbed with a grim smile. He detailed the treachery of Dr. Jones and the exile of Rebecca, his words painting a picture of a legacy nearly stolen by those who feared a king who could truly hear. He watched the faces of his soldiers. Those who had been loyal looked on with a holy awe, while the few who had whispered in the shadows turned a sickly shade of gray. By the time he finished, the Empire was no longer a fractured thing held together by vibrations and fear. It was a singular, focused machine, tuned to the frequency of its master's voice. As the meeting adjourned, the hall cleared, the heavy rhythmic footfalls of his men fading into the distance. Tamara emerged from the shadows of the gallery. She didn't move like the others. Her step was light, a melody of quiet confidence that had become the most important sound in his world. She stopped beside him, looking up at the man who had traded a silent throne for a loud and dangerous reality. Vincent turned to her, the sharp, ticking clock and the distant hum of the city no longer a chaotic assault, but a background symphony. He reached out, his hand gently tracing the line of her jaw. For 30 years, he had been a man of stone, but the sound of Tamara's soft, genuine laugh was the only note he needed to know he was finally home. He looked out the window at the city lights, the sirens and the wind, and the pulse of a million lives creating a beautiful, terrifying noise. He was no longer the placeholder, the deaf ghost of his father's sins. He was Vincent Cialini, the man who heard everything. And as he pulled Tamara closer, the world didn't just feel alive, it sounded like victory. Thanks for watching, and remember to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss interesting stories like this. See you in the next story.